Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. We are so excited to continue reading the New Testament in a year with you. We are still in the book of Mark, and today we are covering Mark 15. In yesterday's chapter, we saw Jesus being arrested, tried before the authorities, and abandoned by his disciples. Now, at the start of chapter 15, the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law come up with a plan to hand Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman governor over the region of Judea. They had to plan this move carefully because they didn't have the authority to carry out a death sentence. Only Rome did. So they needed to paint Jesus as a threat to Rome. In this previous chapter, they decided that Jesus had blasphemed against God. But while this might be a reason for them to want Jesus dead, Pilate wouldn't care. That would have been a religious dispute for them to figure out on their own. So instead, they play up the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews. They wanted to portray him as a traitor to Rome and for crimes against the state, a punishment of crucifixion. It might seem like Pilate is being sort of fair-minded here, but Pilate and the Jews didn't particularly care for each other, and Pilate could sense that the chief priests stood to benefit from Jesus' death. So his reluctance is likely not about justice and more about animosity towards the Jews. Even still, he gives them a choice. He can release Jesus to them, who the leaders have accused of being an insurrectionist, or Barabbas, a literal insurrectionist. Remarkably, the people choose Barabbas over Jesus, who Pilate hands over to be tortured, mocked, and then crucified. And then comes Jesus' crucifixion for the crime of being King of the Jews. Crucifixion was a slow, humiliating, and extremely painful way to die. It was Rome's way of saying, "Do not mess with us, or this will be your fate." And the wine offered to Jesus in verse 23 would have dulled his pain, but Jesus refused, perhaps wanting to face this ordeal with his mind fully alert. Interestingly, Mark tells that Jesus is crucified alongside two other men, probably revolutionaries of some kind. Notice how Mark describes these men as being crucified on Jesus' right hand and left. Back in Mark 10, James and John were asked to sit at Jesus' right and left. They were asking for positions of authority. They wanted influence and prestige. But Mark wants us to see that the path of discipleship is not a path to significance. At least not as the world thinks of significance. To sit at Jesus' right hand and at his left means to share in his suffering, something Mark's original readers needed to be reminded of. After about 3 hours on the cross, darkness came across the land. The significance of this was probably found in the books of Exodus and Amos. In Exodus, the plagues of darkness over Egypt preceded the Passover event, in which God passed over the houses of the Israelites who had the blood of the lamb painted on their doorposts. And in Amos 8, verses 9 and 10, God says that on the day of his judgment, the sun will go down at noon, and that it will be a time to mourn as if for an only son. These describe what's happening in this moment. God's judgment is passing over sinners and falling instead on his only son, whose blood delivers the people from slavery, but not slavery to Egypt, slavery to sin and death. It's at this moment that Jesus dies, but not before giving out a loud cry, which is unusual because crucifixion is designed to exhaust a person until he eventually suffocates to death. Jesus should not have had energy for this. Yet he gives off a shout, which catches the attention of a centurion standing there, who in amazement says, "Truly, this is the Son of God." What an important statement. In the first verse of Mark's Gospel, Mark gives Jesus two titles, Christ and Son of God. At a critical moment in Mark's Gospel, Peter the Jew confessed that Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah. And now, here near the end, we see a Gentile giving Jesus the other title, Son of God. At the moment of Jesus' greatest humiliation, suffering a death reserved for traitors, this man sees in Jesus something other than a common criminal or an ordinary man, and gives him a title that would have been used to describe the emperor, Son of God. And in this context, as Jesus expires, the curtain of the temple is ripped apart from top to bottom. This is a dramatic event that reinforces what Jesus made clear in Mark 13, that the temple is as good as done. It is functionally worthless. His death has opened up a new way to God, a way that is open to all those who follow Jesus. As we behold Jesus in Mark 15, let us first consider Barabbas, who the crowd chose to release rather than Jesus. Barabbas was what Jesus was falsely accused of, an insurrectionist, and therefore he deserved to be crucified, not Jesus. Yet Jesus was crucified, and because of that, Barabbas walked free. What a stunning display of the gospel, that Jesus takes the punishment that our sins deserve so that we may walk free. Our freedom came at great cost to Jesus, and may we never lose sight of that. Secondly, let's consider the mocking jeers of the crowd as Jesus hung on the cross. The crowd who said, "Save yourself by coming down from the cross," in Mark 15:30. But the irony is that if Jesus had saved himself and gotten down, we couldn't be saved. By refusing to save himself, Jesus committed himself to our salvation. It is by his death that we can live. So, as we behold his suffering in this chapter, let us celebrate the life that it brought us. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.